It's been almost 40 years since it was introduced, but the NES has continued to be a relevant part of the gaming space. People can't get enough of the fresh ideas that were born in the 8-bit era thanks to Nintendo's incredibly well-planned system, with its, at least for the time, developer-friendly approach to creating games. Their own titles during this era are some of the most iconic franchises to this day, and for good reason. With their deceptively simple appearance, refined with a ridiculous volume of polish, games like Kid Icarus, Zelda, Mother, Kirby, Super Mario Bros. 3, these have all made an impact. These are titles that many of us would happily pick up and play at any time of day, just to get a short burst of simple and pristine fun. And we'll be discussing these games in this episode, as well as more, revealing secrets in games that are older than most of our audience and us, since we're all young and ever so handsome, obviously. But first off, we're going to start with some good old-timey Super Mario Bros. 2. This second entry of Super Mario Bros. Recognized one element of what made the original Super Mario so great: its horizontal screen scrolling, a revolutionary and truly fundamental mechanic. For the second entry, Nintendo didn't want to have just horizontal screen scrolling, but also vertical scrolling, introducing a whole new way and a whole new dimension in which the player must navigate the bizarre scenery of the game. To make it clear that this was a new feature of the game, the first screen in which the player takes control immediately drops them from a door into a falling state, so the player can easily recognize that falling off the bottom of a screen may not result in immediate death. But this does introduce a question, one to which there'd been no answer, but remained in the minds of many players. If the player's character is falling out of the sky, out of a door, what is on the other side of that door? This is a question that would have been impossible to answer around the game's release on the NES, because there was no method of landing in front of the door or opening it. That is until the modern age of reverse engineering and modifying old game code. If a solid platform is hacked into the game, just below the door, and the player attempts to enter it, a shocking result occurs. The player will respawn back to where they started, though the hacked-in platform will be removed, forcing progress to take place. This isn't just true for the original NES release of the game, however, but also true for the Game Boy Advance release. From one Nintendo classic to another, and this time, rather than answering a question, it's a hidden feature that was overlooked by many players of this cult franchise: Kid Icarus. The game had a hidden feature that enabled Pit to actually haggle with shopkeepers to lower the prices of the store's items. This is done through the use of the second controller attached to the NES system, by simultaneously pressing both the A and B buttons. For the Japanese Famicom release, the secret is even more obscure. The microphone built into the system's second controller is used instead of pressing A and B, with players having to speak into the mic to haggle. The main catch to haggling in the game is that the price of items will only be successfully lowered if Pit's offensive strength is 1 point higher than the first number of the stage that he is currently on when attempting to haggle. So having 2 points of strength when haggling on stage 1, for example, would lead to a good result. If this condition isn't met, the shopkeeper will of course raise the price of the items instead. However, these prices will not change until the shopkeeper's text has finished scrolling across the screen, so there will be a small window of opportunity to still get the item at the right price before he tries to gouge you. This feature was even introduced into the 3DS Classics port, where instead of using a non-existent second controller, the player can haggle using the A button and pressing either Start or Select. Some NES secrets don't just appear within the game themselves, but within the instruction manuals. Zelda II, The Adventure of Link, had a curious situation when it was published in France, without actually receiving a translation into French, at least not fully. Instead, the game was published entirely in English, but with a translated manual and an additional secondary booklet which translated most of the game's text. Pretty rough for kids back in the day, who would spend half their time looking at the screen and half the time staring at the book just to know what the villagers were saying, even if what they say is massively confusing, like the classic "I am error" situation. And this wasn't the only time a game was published in France without an in-game localization. In fact, many NES games were released in Europe only in English, and sometimes they didn't even have a translation manual. Another interesting game on the NES is StarTropics. Both this game and its sequel were exclusive to the West. never having a release in Japan, and the second game only made it to Europe thanks to the Wii U Virtual Console. The NES release of the first game actually included a letter inside the game's packaging from the in-game character Dr. Jones. This is the basis of one of the biggest hurdles of kids back in the day. During the events of the game, Dr. Jones will tell you to dip the letter into water, though many assumed that this was a reference to an in-game item. You can imagine the confusion this caused as a result. The player actually needed to physically dip the letter included in the box into water in order to reveal a secret code written in invisible ink, something which many players would be reluctant to do, and we're pretty sure we would all be too. This led to Nintendo Power getting involved, where they published the code that the player was supposed to take from this letter, 747, in their Counselor's Corner section, which was created to help players who got stuck in games. For the game's digital release on the Wii Virtual Console, this of course became impossible, so the code was instead added to the game's manual, which displays a short animation of the letter being dipped into a bucket before revealing the code. On the Wii U, the animation was removed, and it was simply explained that the original release involved physically dipping a letter, and the Nintendo Switch release just doesn't include any digital alternative, and as a result, makes progressing impossible without having to look online. Another curiosity involves an item which features in the game, the Island Yo-Yo. This name was met with some complications over the years as a result of the word yo-yo being copyrighted in Canada. This meant that the item needed to be renamed when it came to a digital release, so it was changed to the Island Star in order to avoid any infringement. Yet another interesting fact can be found in the game's sequel, Zoda's Revenge, StarTropics 2. When the player finds the pizza delivery person in the middle of the desert in the game's third chapter, they'll be riding a turtle which strongly resembles a Koopa Trooper from the Super Mario series. Quite a sly homage, if you ask us. One game with an interesting international story is Mother, the game that came before the massively popular Earthbound. This title originally only saw a release in Japan, but a US release was intended at one stage, with localization work having been completed to remove content unsuitable for the West, and translating the game's text into English. 14 years after the Japanese release of the game on the Famicom, Nintendo re-released the game in Japan alongside Earthbound in the Mother 1 and 2 compilation for the Game Boy Advance. Though this Japanese exclusive release is a curious one because the version of Mother included on the cart was actually the then unreleased American NES localized version of the game, which had then been translated back into Japanese. We know this because of the censorship changes made to the game, as well as the addition of a new ending, at least to Japanese fans, that was included in the then unreleased English version. Another change is that the movement on the game's overworld is not tile-based, and instead allows for more fluid movement similar to Earthbound, as well as the smash icon having its palette fixed, stopping it from taking on the colours of whatever enemy the player is currently facing. Another change is that the sing command is only usable in the final battle of the game, while in the original, the player could use it in any battle so long as Nintendo's party had already sung the 8 melodies to Queen Mary. One more NES title that had regional differences is Little Nemo, the Dream Master. This revolutionary title let the main character ride a reptile months before Super Mario World even released, and even gave players a choice on which creature they'd mount. One of the rideable creatures in the game is Gorilla, which appears to be a perfectly normal gorilla in the North American and European versions of the game. In the Japanese game, however, this gorilla quite likes to smoke the odd cigar. The character Flip would also smoke cigars in the Japanese game, but the two characters had to give up their habit for their international debut. Despite this, however, the game's manual in Western regions still features artwork of the gorilla and a smoking cigar, and the gorilla's sprite still has curled lips as if it were holding the cigar in its mouth. Speaking of alterations to a game, Kirby's Adventure has an absolute ton of content that was cut before the game received its release. According to the Kirby's Dream Collection Celebration booklet, a number of ideas were removed from the game entirely, which would have seen the player able to dig holes, turn invisible, multiply, and even turn into a puddle of water. Most of these ideas never made it past the initial planning and sketching phase, though an unused ability does appear to still be in the game's data. The graphics for a mini Kirby can be found, which would suggest that the game was set to allow the player to become tiny, similar to an ability which would appear in a much later entry of the Kirby series, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. Because of where these graphics are found in the NES game's data, it's speculated by many that this ability wound up being replaced by the UFO ability. More unused graphics can even be found showing an unused 7th stage door, suggesting that there is an original plan to have 7 stages in at least one of the game's main hubs. Though in the final release, the most stages a hub area contains is 6. Oddly, one piece of unused data is technically still used in the final release. There was originally a cannon icon that would appear whenever Kirby was on a cannon, and while it was cut from the game for its original purpose, the cannon icon can still be seen when using the mix ability. During the roulette section of abilities, the cannon icon can still be seen, though it's unlikely any real human would have noticed this without the use of frame-by-frame advancement. Though, as a slight curiosity, for some reason this icon takes on its original purpose in only the French release of the game, and nobody knows why. And now it's time for some trivia from the NES game that we get asked about the most by far, Super Mario Bros. 3. You may already know that the whistle sound effect in the game comes from The Legend of Zelda. But this isn't the only audio reference in Mario 3. The Tanuki Mario transformation sound effect actually originates from the mysterious Murasame Castle. A Japan-only Nintendo game made with the same engine as the original Legend of Zelda and released 2 full years before Mario 3. There's a great region-long video on that. It's the first one I ever did if you want to cringe an old voiceover. Another secret in the game is that for some reason, the hammer suit item that pops out of a large question block appears to actually be a Toad suit. The other items, the frog and Tanuki suits, actually match their inventory sprites, so several sleuths have posed the question, why is one different and not matching? Though it was fixed in the Super NES and Game Boy Advance remakes. It's worth noting that in the original game, the hammer suit is something of a secret power-up, as it only shows up in hidden areas and randomly from Toad houses, though in later versions, it is made to consistently appear in certain Toad houses. This could be why the outfit appears to be a Toad when small, but even this seems a bit nonsensical since all the other small suit sprites match their larger suit sprites. So yeah, it's a mystery. Did you also know that Super Mario Bros. 3 had several more secrets and cultural references hidden within it? Or that Super Mario 64 has several changes from its Japanese release? For a whole bunch more Mario facts, check out the video on screen. What's your favorite NES game? I imagine probably quite a lot of you didn't have the console. Shut up, kid. Nobody cares about your ball.